Good morning, everyone. Welcome. So nice to see you here. This is a seminar in the Bolin Center seminar series. And today it's hosted by Research Area 3 of the Bolin Center that focuses on hydrosphere, cryosphere, and climate. The Bolin Center is a consortium of scientists working with research and graduate education in the climate system. Over 300 scientists are involved in the Bolin Center. And it's a collaboration between SMHI, Stockholm University, and KTH, Royal Institute of Technology. The Bolin Center was founded 2006, so we're 12 years old now. And it was named in honor after Bert Bolin, professor, and one of the founders of IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and also a big contributor to our understanding of the climate system. And today it's a growing research community that's a transdisciplinary research environment with research on natural climate variability, climate history, climate processes, and climate modeling, and also climate impacts on the environment and human impacts on the climate system. This seminar today will be on Arctic hydrology, and we're very fortunate to have Professor Terry Prowse here today to talk to us about the Arctic freshwater synthesis and some emerging adaptation strategies. And with that, I will leave over the word to Terry. Welcome, Terry.
Thank you. Arvid didn't mention that at the conclusion of this, there will be a small exam. It'll be it's your choice to have it true or false or a multiple choice, right? So you'll have to talk to him about which type of exam you want to have at the end. So if you can, you've got them here, don't you? Yeah. Oh, okay. All right. Anyway, yes. So a review of the Arctic freshwater synthesis and emerging adaptation strategies. Okay, I'll give you some background and whatever. I've given a talk, something like this, modified it a little bit, but hopefully this is clear enough for you, that history rationale. There's increasing scientific recognition that changes to the Arctic freshwater systems have produced and could produce even greater changes to biogeophysical and socioeconomic systems of special importance to northern residents, and also produce some extra Arctic effects that will have global consequences. So this is sort of like how I got drawn into this thing, and why I got approached by 3 different groups. So the World Climate Research Program, Climate in the Cryosphere Project, the International Arctic Science Committee, IASC, and AMAP. And so I ended up getting all these letters from the 3 groups. Hey, would you go ahead and do this, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how they hooked me into doing this. And so then I set it up, and it was not just me, but I broke it down into different groups: atmosphere, oceans, terrestrial hydrology, terrestrial ecology, resources. And I had 2 co-leads, Arvid being one of them, and Johanna being the other co-lead. Anyway, and these are the different groups that asked me to get involved. And this is the way it was essentially structured: information from historical trends and literature and all these, and then also climate models. You know, how are we going to get, how has the past been replicated, and how good are the projections for the future? And these are all the different leads for each of the components. And as it ended up, there were 41 authors from 10 countries. And it was like 3.5 years of many meetings that I can't recall where I was in the world doing all this type of stuff or whatever. Anyway, so what's this stem from? Well, there was early Arctic freshwater focus, stems from Weil's 1968. This is a really interesting paper, The Role of Oceans in Climate Change, A Theory of Ice Ages. And theory of ice ages, like the Little Ice Age, et cetera, which all focused essentially on thermohaline circulation, right? Things, you get maximum radiation at the equator. So second law of thermodynamics is that warm goes to cold. So by atmosphere, there's atmospheric circulation from the equator to the poles, but there's also oceanic, right? The thermohaline circulation. So you get transport of heat up into the North Atlantic in this case, and the water tends to cool off, become denser, more saline, and sink in these various gyres that are in the North Atlantic. There's a few gyres around the globe. Anyway, and what's significant about the gyres is that, okay, you have the water going north in the Atlantic, cooling off, sinking because, you know, salinity differences, temperature differences. But the other thing that can disturb the gyres and how the water would sink in these gyres and go back down and get warm again in the more southern latitudes and then be circulated back up and release heat in the North Atlantic. And that's why, you know, London doesn't have the climate of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, right? It's getting heat transported in. But if you ever there are these thermohaline catastrophes in the past, the Little Ice Age, et cetera, when Europe, et cetera, didn't get any heat coming in. And those are referred to as thermohaline catastrophes that have happened. And so the gyres can be shut down. And one big factor that can affect it is also the amount of fresh water that ends up in these gyres. And there's a lot of transport of water out of the Arctic Ocean, potentially going into these gyres. And so I got involved a few years ago, and we had a meeting in Tallinn, Estonia, and produced this book, The Freshwater Budget of the Arctic Ocean. And Howard Cattle at the time, he says, why do you hydrologists keep giving us different numbers for the total river flow to the Arctic Ocean? And the big concern is, well, the Arctic Ocean, it's only about 1% of world ocean volume. But depending on whose numbers you use, it gets 10% of global runoff. And that's mainly all these big Arctic rivers that are flowing in, dumping water into the Arctic Ocean, plus relatively low saline water coming in through the Bering Strait from the Pacific. And they can export into these gyres. So fresh water can suddenly come out, go into those gyres. Fresh water is lighter than saline water, so then it can stop the gyre, right? And that's where you could end up with these thermohaline catastrophes if you have too much fresh water coming out into these gyres. So that's why there was this big interest, and we had this meeting with, and I represented the Rivers group. And then I took Howard's question to heart and went back and analyzed things. And then I went, oh, okay, it's because people are using different definitions of what the contributing area is to the Arctic Ocean. There's all these different definitions, all Arctic Ocean basin, et cetera. And these are different definitions of actually what the area is that's flowing into the Arctic Ocean. But then I went back and analyzed things, all the different definitions, and Molly is actually Mackenzie, Ob, Lena, Yenisei, the combination of these rivers. And there's a linear relationship between the amount of flow going into it and the basin area that contributes. So it's really it's linear. You just need to figure out what is the contributing area or definition that you're going to use to figure out what the flow is to the Arctic Ocean. But of all the components that actually go in, the percentage of fresh water, so I mentioned about these are the different things that can actually affect the Arctic Ocean. River runoff is the dominant one, no matter what definition you actually use of the Arctic Ocean. But then over time, okay, there's lots of changes. You know, we've got melt off the Greenland ice sheet, which can actually, boom, go directly into the gyres. Arctic precipitation changes, rapid retreat of glaciers, Eurasian discharge was going up, et cetera, et cetera. So then there have been a whole bunch of studies. I mean, we started out with that freshwater budget of the Arctic Ocean, which really set it up internationally. Oh, hey, this is important. You know, these thermohaline catastrophes, something, you know. So, International Conference in Arctic Research Planning, and then the Arctic Champ program was formed in the United States, Arctic Hydra. So there's a broadening of these different assessments, and more knowledge was gathered with time. Now that's essentially the circulation system, domain of the Arctic freshwater system, showing 4 Arctic Ocean gateways, 9 convective gyres, major ocean currents, and the all Arctic regions definition of the terrestrial contributing area. But we took it in one, well, and if you take that definition, all Arctic regions, that's the area in red. What's interesting, and Arvid, you would have delved into some of this stuff, et cetera, for the Arctic Freshwater Synthesis. If you actually look at, this is contributing area by latitude. All right, so there's the MOLI definition. There's the all Arctic regions. By the time you hit the Arctic Circle, you've already got 75% of the contributing area already in there. So, I mean, I was working with some of the oceanographers. Even Eddie Carmack mentioned this to me. He said, oh, you know, I work with fellow oceanographers. Some of them think, you know, these Arctic rivers are coming in, that it's just local runoff just coming in. They don't realize that, you know, okay, like for the Mackenzie, no, the major sources of water and things are coming from the Banff, Alberta, you know, that far down south. So if you even look at the definition by, that's the all Arctic regions again, by the time you get to the Arctic Circle, you've got 81% of precipitation that's contributing to that flow already in the system. And for the Mackenzie, Ob, Lena, Yenisei, the big 4 major rivers, you got 98% already contributed by the time you hit the Arctic Circle. So it's more mid-latitude. You know, that's where all the changes that control the flow into the Arctic Ocean. There's stuff going on and further south. So that's when we got into this Arctic freshwater system synthesis. And we produced a Journal of Geophysical Research-Biogeosciences, and that's the structure of it, and a layman's report. And I do have a little reference. So that's the journal publication, which has got a chapter, you know, I mentioned to you the different components. And then this is the dumbed down version. And this was released at in Fairbanks. They had it in Alaska, and I guess it was deputy director from Finland or whatever. She was totally impressed by this. She said, this is the first time I've really been able to understand something. I'm going to take this home and give it to my minister of da-da-da-da-da, whatever. So I guess this layman's report is, yeah, without having to sort of work through all this, it was distilled down into the key issues anyway in that. Okay, so key emerging issues. This is actually the final paper, and these are 4 key things that came out of it. An expanded Arctic freshwater domain, new freshwater regimes, enhanced lake moisture flux, and something about freshwater resources. So this is the, when I sat down with Eddie Carmack, the oceanographer side of things, and we looked at it, and we went, oh, okay, no, the white area is the contributing area, right? There are those gyres again. But then the big question came up, what about all the flow coming out of the St. Lawrence River system? We know what some of the ocean currents are, because I just went over that in thermohaline circulation, right? Can that actually be transported in to the North Atlantic as well, and possibly affect those convective gyres? And yes, the conclusion out of it was, yes, it could. So then we even got a broader definition of what the contributing area is that affects these gyres, thermohaline circulation. So a related expanded terrestrial contributing area. And then I went back and, okay, analyzed, boom, and there it is up there, AFD, which is the Arctic freshwater domain. And you see it's still on a pretty much linear relationship, but it also means that as hydrologists, to understand this, we're going to actually have to look at the contributing basins to the Great Lakes in Canada and the US, right? That's also important in terms of the total flow. So as hydrologists, oh, okay, we're not simply working at the export channels, right, for these rivers. We've got to understand even basin hydrology around the Great Lakes. And on top of that, coming back and working with the oceanographers, some of that flow coming out there also affects these, the hydrologic cycle between the boundaries within the Arctic Ocean controls then storm tracks of way water is carried to the continents as well. It's quite significant in terms of the thermal structure, fresh and saline water influencing storm tracks. So that was another one in there. And then, unfortunately, Johanna couldn't be here this morning, but big changes in hydroecological regime shifts with the changes in hydrology affecting vegetation relationships, et cetera, et cetera. And then new freshwater development of a near-shore hydroecological regime. And this is one that I've been playing up a little bit back in Canada, and I'll show you in a minute what we plan on doing with it. But if you think about it, we've got retreating sea ice on the Arctic coast, more open water, and actually flows near the coast, the riverine coastal domain, enhanced ocean evaporation, transport back onto the land, more precip onto the landscape. At the same time, you're thawing permafrost. So then we have precip infiltration into thawing permafrost, and therefore an increase in the geochemical transport out into the ocean. So the geochemistry and the flux, nutrients, et cetera, going out into the marine environment, and that is a big driver of Arctic marine productivity. I'll mention something in a second here. Anyway, and if you think about how much coastline we have that's potentially affected by that, the total length of northern hemisphere coastline affected by permafrost is approximately or 34% of the world's coastline. So that's a massive area. And if you think about it, well, the Canadian archipelago, right, with all the islands, that's a huge part of the shoreline contribution. So you get that thawing permafrost, all that stuff going out there, that could be a huge driver of marine productivity. Transitions in marine biological systems, we go over this, that's that riverine coastal domain. Few comments about, how it's affecting nutrient flux, et cetera, et cetera. If you want to delve into that, it's the oceans chapter covers this. And so, which went and drove another idea that I had. I was fortunate enough that I got to go on the Louis Saint Laurent icebreaker through the Northwest Passage. I got to see, so we went through the Northwest Passage, and this is sort of the flux that you're getting off a thawing permafrost landscape. You can see the turbidity changes near the shore, et cetera, et cetera. But I also learned on this trip that, people can't work on marine productivity as it's influenced by the changing hydrology, because you can't get a big deep draft boat like that in the Canadian Coast Guard. The ships are simply too big to get in to sample in that near-shore riverine coastal domain. We can't get samples of marine productivity or freshwater fluxes, geochemistry, et cetera, et cetera. So we talked about that quite a bit on board, and well, there I am, but this guy beside me in the middle there heard some of this, and I had a few discussions with him. That's Jim Balsillie, who is the co-founder of BlackBerry. And Jim, started talking about this, whatever, and then he fronted us a whole bunch of money. Enough, $250,000, to be able to buy a shallow draft boat, which is now being refitted in just near Victoria, Canada, where I'm from, for another $250,000. And then it'll be shipped up to the Arctic so that we can actually go out and sample. And So this is a program that I've been working on developing between Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Institute of Ocean Sciences, and Environment Canada and Climate Change Canada. And we're calling it the Kitikmeot Sea and Watershed Study. So Kitikmeot is actually a region of Nunavut, but it's a big area. You can see all these rivers flowing into this basin, and that's where we plan on. That's actually where they found the Fram and what's the other boat that sank? Nah, it's not the Vasa. Brandy, help me out. The Franklin expeditions, right? The Fram and the...
I don't know.
Anyway, when Franklin came over, right, exploring the Northwest Passage, right, and the ship sank, Anyway. Okay, so that's what's going on in terms of marine flux, but there's also the potential here that we went over in terms of, oh my God, look at the area and abundance of lakes in the high latitude basins as well. And if you lose the ice cover, the same thing could happen on freshwater ecology, right? It doesn't have to be the marine, but actually within lake systems, right? Retreating lake ice, enhanced evaporation, moisture transport, and flux in. So, and that's not really been studied. That's an area of future research that people haven't picked up on yet. Okay, now moving into freshwater resources. Okay, so with all these changes going on in the freshwater system, it can create a lot of risks, caribou on breakup, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there are some potential benefits as well. And both the risks and benefits need some form of adaptation. All right, so how do you adapt to this changing freshwater system? Resources, hydropower, changing economic value from changes in storage and altered nival pluvial, so frozen rainfall regimes, hazard from inflow design floods and extreme events. But there's also an adaptation opportunity. Now, I've talked about this a little bit, that think about all the small northern communities. All the streams used to, everything would freeze up, et cetera. Okay, if they do lose their ice cover, then there's a potential of putting in small-scale hydro, such that you don't have these, it's another way of actually, instead of supplying oil and gas by tanker or whatever, up to northern communities, there's a potential on the adaptation side of putting in small-scale hydro. A little bit of it is done in mid-latitudes in Canada, but not in the higher latitudes, and that could well expand out the potential. And there are also implications on the resources side for water supply and wastewater storage. Changes in water budgets and permafrost thaw affecting mine waste storage and water supply systems. New engineering requirements to adapt are required, and one thing definitely that's a possibility is using cryopiles or thermal siphons. Essentially, it refreezes the ground. The heat's transported up, so it refreezes. So if you've got, tailings ponds out there, and the big fear is that, oh, we've got all this stuff can get into the groundwater system if you got thawing permafrost, et cetera. No, you need to reestablish that local permafrost so to stop all that ugly stuff going down into the system. And on transportation, reduced ice road network leads to large economic costs for remote and industry, because the only way you can get in some of the big stuff into northern industrial sites is using ice roads. So there needs to be some method of reestablishing some of the ice roads. And this is some work that I did with spray ice, et cetera, actually to thicken ice roads, thicken ice covers, et cetera. You can drill in slush, or you can use spray ice, because definitely if you lose the ice road systems, you can't go back onto the landscape because, for roads, because you got thawing permafrost, And that's a huge cost, although in Canada right now they're finally putting in the Inuvik-Tuk Highway.
Yeah, I think they did it.
Yeah. So they finally put that investment in. So it would require a huge investment in terms of thawing permafrost to deal with that, because Inuvik to Tuk always was an ice road. That's the one that I used to work on, et cetera. And then this is another aspect, changing river ice regimes. Dam flow releases to produce ice jam flooding of drying landscapes already successfully tested. So if we're losing out on some of the ice cover, like ice jams, et cetera, are a big driver of supplying fresh water to nearshore basins, right? To elevated basins like the Mackenzie Delta, you know, with all the lakes and all that type of stuff. The only way you get water back up over those berms and things into those lakes, you get an ice jam, boom, and it floods over top. So you could modify the flow, critical times, to actually cause some ice jamming within the system. And this is a paper I published years back. You probably can't read it, but Restoring Ice Jam Flooding to a Drying Delta Ecosystem. And it was the Peace Athabasca Delta in Canada, a huge delta system. Wasn't getting any ice jam, so I made recommendations, must be 15 years ago or whatever, to BC Hydro in Canada to release some extra flow just at a critical time that came down the Peace River system and helped create an ice jam that backwater flooded. So it's sort of it's a response to a climate change. It's an adaptation approach. All right. This is a piece out of another talk that I've given. I thought I'd put this in. Potential adaptation issue related to an intensification of the hydrologic cycle. With climate warming, there'll be an intensification of the hydrologic cycle. Let me see. Oh. Did my arrows speed up? Yeah. They did. Okay. All right. You know, so you got an increase in mean water vapor, evaporation, precip, et cetera. Overall, it's projected increased water availability simply because you're speeding up the hydrologic cycle also. However, it's going to vary significantly in time and in space. And if we look back, and Arvid, you've delved into some of this stuff, right? And then your review chapter, et cetera. This is something I wrote many years ago, but projected increases in south to north contrast in precip and stream flow with increased global mean temperatures, right? So percentage of mean annual stream flow for a rise of 2 degrees from 5 global climate models and 11 global hydrologic models, and relative change there, you can see it's quite significant. Okay, so you're going to end up with water rich and water poor. What might be the response? And I'm not recommending this stuff. I'm just raising it that if you go back, like NWAPA, right? North Atlantic Water and Power Alliance, that was a plan way back. The Russians also had plans for diverting Arctic rivers, getting it down where you need the water. These plans have existed for some time. And hey, it's not to say that there isn't some infrastructure big within North America even now. The All-American Canal, biggest diversion systems in place. And actually, shouldn't mention, largest source of drownings or something as well, because so many people try and cross that canal. Okay. Flow redistribution implications for transboundary river flows. These are all the major transboundary flow locations that I've marked on here for Canada. With climatic redistribution of water resources, there'll be a widening gap between what I call water-rich and water-poor regions. There may well be called for increased and/or new water provisions, right? Because of all the historical ones, people may say, hey, we're water-poor. All this excess flow up north, hey, bring some of that down south. But there's large policy implications because of all the transboundary flow areas within Canada anyway for this. And I would say that's probably a circumpolar issue. Now, there's a whole bunch of rationales, and I've summarized them here because I've been involved in some of this, against diverting, right? oh, invasive species, in-stream flow needs, you need to keep the, you need certain flows for fish, et cetera, within the river system. You can't pull it out and then, fish will have to grow legs, whatever, right? Effects on marine productivity, climate feedback, sea ice, and thermohaline circulation. So I've put in here, that's sort of the projected increase for the McKinsey, 20% increase. All right, there it is. There is a 20% increase. Essentially, it makes the McKinsey, what we called earlier, a water-rich area because the flows are going up. If the climate-induced increase is removed, but the historical flow is retained, so there I removed it, you're back, right? If you take that 20% off, you're back with the original hydrograph for the river. So the fish are still okay. They didn't have to grow legs to walk on the land and all that type of stuff. But what's the significance of that flow? Well, only 1/3 of the projected increase of that 2,000 is equal, so it's around 650, is the annual flow of the Saskatchewan River system, a water-poor region, and one that's becoming poorer, right? It's that area, enhanced warming, and big agricultural production too, big demands for fresh water. So if you're living down in a water-poor region, there may well be people saying, hey, all that water increase up there, we need it down here. I'm not suggesting that you divert water, but in terms of the people out there in a water-poor region and they know other people are getting water-rich, is that going to come out? That seems to me to be a potential big emerging policy concern that people are going to have to be prepared for. Oh, and projected water resulting from, okay, growth and disparity between water rich and water poor, range of socioeconomic hardships for water poor, but some water rich may become too rich. And that's actually happened in Canada, that, there was a huge increase in flow and they actually diverted out of Devil's Lake. So there may well be calls for enhanced redistribution of water. Does flow reduction by transfer to a previous normal flow have negative consequences, e.g. in-stream flow needs, and I just talked about that. Increasing need to store water with infrastructure as natural snow regime storage diminishes, and other economic implications, conflicts for multiple users and a rise in value where scarcity increases, and a more focus on interjurisdictional hydroelectric power sharing. Okay, so I hope you're not too overloaded after this talk. You get that, right? Okay. If you do feel overloaded, I suggest, if you want things that are sort of condensed down, AFS Summary, so the Arctic Freshwater Synthesis Summaries. I wrote an editor's box for that's available online through the AGU site, the Earth and Space Science News. It's got it distilled down to about 1,000 words. I did contribute to SWEPA 1 in 2011, and then SWEPA, so AMAP came after me again and said, can you distill this thing down into a chapter, one chapter? You're an author on it, by the way. And so there is a chapter, only chapter 4 on freshwater in SWEPA 2, which you can find online on the AMAP site. If you just go to AMAP, you'll see SWEPA 2017, and you can download from that site. Or if you're interested in getting a copy of the journal itself, I had a whole bunch paid for it, pretty costly, run off that people have requested and we've been sending out. And the same goes with the condensed version. If you would, for journal copies, just if you want to write it down, if you're interested, to Haley Linton, she's my research assistant back at in Victoria, haleylinton@gmail.com, and just provide her your address and she'll mail you a copy. I didn't have big enough luggage, especially after that fiasco yesterday. I don't know if I had a nightmare of a day yesterday. Air Canada's complete computer systems crashed, and there have been people internationally stuck. Planes couldn't take off, reservation systems were out, the whole works. So we had a bit of a nightmare day yesterday getting here. Anyway, so if you're interested, HaleyLinton@gmail.com. Give her your address, say I'm interested in the condensed version or the journal version. Give her your address, mailing address, and she'll mail you a copy. Okay. What brought me over here, I lured him into that. He's luring me into the next step, right? And we have 2 days more of meetings on this. ARC-FRY now, Changing Arctic Freshwater Resources, Opportunities and Challenges for Science and Policy. And that's what we're going to be working on for the next 2 days. How many of us are going to be here?
7. I think we're going to be in a workshop.
Is Valari coming?
Yeah.
Buglinsky? Yeah, good. All right, so there's some, well, and Timos? Yeah, good, okay. There's a few people from the Arctic Freshwater Synthesis that agreed to go ahead and do more on this. Brandy's going to be there. Brandy is a master's and now PhD student of mine, and she was a co-author on the Atmosphere chapter, and now she's going to be involved in ARC-FRY, and if there's a lot of hard work, I'm going to give it to her to do. So anyway, that wraps it up. So you do have a choice, like I said. You can have a multiple choice exam or a true and false, so long as you register with Arvid, and he can arrange for that after. That's enough for me. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Terry, for this talk. And we have time for questions. There are things that have for Terry. Yeah, Stefano?
Thank you very much for the very comprehensive presentation. One of the issues you raised is about increased runoff and possibly groundwater flow in the Arctic. And you mentioned that this could affect productivity.
Marine productivity, yeah, and possibly lake productivity as well, yeah.
Yeah, lake or ocean productivity. Yeah. So I wonder though, Arctic soils are kind of nutrient poor, especially nitrogen poor. So perhaps this increased runoff will increase the carbon export to the water bodies rather than nutrient export, which could fuel heterotrophs rather than phytoplankton.
Definitely the carbon is a biggie. And that is played up, yeah. Definitely the carbon flux, definitely. Yeah. So in terms of its, yeah, so it's written up here in terms of overall geochemistry changes, whatever. And I'm not an oceanographer, that's why I listen to the oceanographers. Oh, okay, what are the big things that drive it? Because also, you put more organics out there, then you also have a problem with light penetration though, right? So then you got a problem, oh, it's not getting down, and oh, okay, so there could be some negative effects as well, yeah. So, but definitely the influence on marine productivity, yeah.
Okay, question over here.
Thank you for the presentation. Is there in this northern territory, are there long-term hydrochemistry and discharge stations available also to see a trend? Things
definitely on the discharge. On the geochemistry, not enough.
Because I think that's the
the water quality. Yeah,
for the future.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I have had a talk with because our past director, she's now director of. So it used to be the water quantity side, et cetera, and she's gone over into water quality, director on the water quality and environment and climate change Canada. And I've said to her, oh, well, it would be great to have enhanced monitoring sites going in here to get more regular sampling of changes in water quality. And we'll see whether that evolves. It does seem such a logical thing, because such a changing environment. And what's driving it, I showed you that Jim Balsley and the boat and all that type of stuff. We have our government put out joint mandate letters to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada and the Minister of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans that they jointly need to work on the effects of climate change on nearshore marine productivity. So there's actually government level sort of, hey, this is something that we've heard indirectly that should be done. So that's why that boat, I'm trying to get that Katipniot study going and whatever, but like what you're suggesting, yeah, okay, but that should also affect our hydrometric water quality sampling program as well. Let's get...
It's just a snapshot sampling.
Yeah, yeah, and that's, yeah, there's not enough there to be able to, yeah, put those pieces together yet. Yeah, because the changes should be big.
Can I ask one more question? One other question is, you showed this hydrograph, this annual hydrograph, and...
Oh, for the Mackenzie?
Yeah, and 20% increase, but isn't it that maybe it's not only 20% increase, but just a regime shift, that the peak is in the different months?
And timing
might also influence like management decisions.
Yeah, yeah, it's the timing. It's not just the overall, yeah. So my plot there doesn't have a temporal aspect to it. You're right. It's the seasonal shift too that could be quite important as well. But it's only to set up, that was only to set up discussion, right? Sort of like, oh, okay, here's the average flow increase to, because some of those models that are run, they don't get down into the seasonal side of things. It's just, oh, that's why I had those blank number of GCMs and blank number of hydro, and just took that percentage just to promote the discussion about, oh, what's the total flow increase? Oh, okay, there's all this water going on up there. So, but yeah, the seasonal shifts is quite significant, and ecologically it's quite significant.
Just before a quick comment on the monitoring of geochemistry that there is, or water chemistry, that there is now beginning to become something of a time series, at least in a project that started as a research project with limited time, but is now sustained over, I think, 10 years. What used to be called the Partners Project, and it's now the Arctic Great Rivers Observatory, Arctic GRO, Arctic GROW, maybe it should be pronounced.
Partners.
And I think it's about 10 years for the largest half-dozen rivers or something like that, or maybe a bit more, with quite a few of long-term sampling, and they're adding more parameters also. So there is something, but definitely not near enough to understand what's going on in the system.
Thank you. I had a question about the terrestrial hydrology and what you found when you looked at wetlands. You talked a little bit about lakes and changes in ice regime and the intensification of the hydrologic cycles.
Yeah.
Did you see any studies on?
Oh, there's lots around on, there is.
On how?
There's a fair bit on terms of wetlands and organics and all, yes.
Yes.
And how it affects it.
If you, what background are those studies? Is it more from a hydrological point of view, or?
No, there's some done on the geochemistry too. Yeah. And some areas too. I mean, you get into massive wetland and contributing, and they're actually a water quantity controller as well, depending their drying cycles, etc. So it's a geochemistry and water. So it's water quality and water quantity issue.
Okay, thank you. Further questions? Any other questions from the audience? No?
Oh, it's exam time then.
Okay. Yeah, that's the answer. Well, I think I had also one question regarding the water transfer, and I agree with you that this will probably surface as a policy issue, even though you'd think from a natural science point of view that it's not doesn't make sense. But what I hear about these big ideas is that they also tend to stumble on costs. I mean, it's just not feasible, or you can't defend those investments. So do you think that's going to be the final hurdle that will stop this from?
We'll see. I've seen some things written, even about, it would be so easy the way this basin is set up, to transport. I've seen things like that before written. You're right. Like, I mean, if you compare it to the that American canal system, right? I mean, yes, mammoth costs. But I have seen some other stuff written about, it would be South Saskatchewan River System, et cetera, that, but simply modifying, all you need is a slight change in the hydrologic divide here, and that flow would come in this system and then be transported down there. So I had, years ago, stuff was written about that as well. And now with climate change, even driving this further, et cetera, and if people are taking these projections and saying, oh, gee, the benefits here, there may well be people arguing for, I'm not arguing for it, but there may well be. That's why I'm just trying to raise it as a policy issue that people should be aware that this may come up down the road.
Yeah, there's clearly existing major water diversions in that region of Canada with the Nelson River, and you have these huge Churchill's River systems. And also other examples from China with canal systems that tend not to be super successful, even at huge investment cost, but still being built. Okay, if there are no further questions, I'd like to thank Terry for coming here and for the audience to listening. And yeah, looking forward to seeing you at the next Bolin Center seminar series. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks for listening.